There are people who leave a room and something feels lighter. And then there are others who say very little, do very little, yet somehow everything inside feels heavier after they're gone. It is not always loud, not always obvious. Sometimes it feels like confusion, sometimes like guilt, sometimes like a quiet exhaustion that has no clear reason. Energy is not just physical, it is emotional, psychological, invisible, but deeply felt. And over time, certain patterns begin to reveal themselves, not in what people say, but in how they make others feel. This is not about blame, not about labeling others as good or bad. It is about awareness, because once something is seen clearly, it can no longer quietly take from you. It does not begin with a clear moment. There is no loud signal, no visible shift that can easily be named. Just a feeling, a quiet heaviness that appears without asking for permission. You sit with someone and nothing seems wrong. The conversation moves, words are exchanged, time passes in an ordinary way. But somewhere beneath that surface, something changes. Your thoughts begin to slow. Your body feels slightly tense. There is a subtle effort in simply being present, as if attention itself has become heavier to carry. And when it ends, there is relief. Not dramatic relief, not something that demands explanation, just a quiet sense that something has lifted. For a long time, this feeling is misunderstood. It is easy to blame the day, the workload, the lack of sleep, because these are familiar explanations, comfortable ones. They do not require deeper questioning. But slowly, patterns begin to form. The same feeling returns. Not everywhere, not with everyone, only in certain spaces, only around certain people. And that is where awareness begins. Not as certainty, but as a question. Why does this feel different? There are people whose presence feels neutral, iyasi. Silence with them does not demand anything. Conversation flows without effort. Even disagreement does not disturb the inner balance. And then there are others where silence feels uncomfortable, where words feel like they must be chosen carefully, where even small interactions carry an invisible weight. It is not always about what is said. In fact, sometimes nothing obvious is said at all. No harsh words, no direct negativity, and yet something lingers. A tone, a pattern, an emotional undercurrent that is difficult to describe but impossible to ignore once it is noticed. This is where many people begin to doubt themselves, because there is no clear evidence, no moment that can be pointed to and explained. So the mind searches for logic. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it is just a mood. Maybe it is being imagined. And so the feeling is dismissed again and again. But the body does not dismiss it. The body remembers. It remembers the slight tension in the shoulders, the quiet fatigue after simple conversations, the sense of needing space without fully understanding why. And over time, that memory becomes clearer than logic, because emotional experience does not always need explanation to be real. It simply needs to be felt. There is something important hidden in this early stage, before labels, before definitions. There is pure recognition, a noticing that not all presence feels the same. Some people bring ease without effort. Others bring tension without intention, and neither is always conscious. Because people do not always choose the emotional patterns they carry. They move through the world with internal landscapes shaped long before this moment. Unseen pressures, unspoken fears, unresolved emotions that quietly influence how they exist around others. And sometimes those internal states are not contained within them. They extend outward, subtly, quietly, touching the emotional space of those around them, not as something aggressive, but as something absorbing, something that takes a little more than it gives. At first, it feels small, almost unimportant, easy to ignore, but small things, repeated over time, begin to shape larger experiences. And this is how emotional exhaustion can begin without being noticed, not through a single moment, but through many subtle ones, each interaction leaving behind a trace, until one day the pattern becomes too consistent to ignore, and the question returns: why does this feel different? This question does not demand an immediate answer. It does not rush toward judgment. It simply opens a space where awareness can exist without pressure, because understanding does not begin with certainty. It begins with noticing, and in that noticing, something important starts to shift, not in them, but within perception itself. A quiet separation forms between what is felt and what is automatically accepted, and that separation is the first step toward seeing clearly. Not everything that feels heavy belongs to the moment. Sometimes it belongs to the presence, and once that is sensed, even faintly, the experience of connection is never quite the same again. No one begins as a weight. No one enters the world intending to take more than they give. And yet, somewhere along the way, certain patterns begin to form, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, because the way a person shows up in the present is often shaped by what they have carried from the past. Long before any interaction happens, there is already a history beneath it, unseen but active. Every person carries an internal world, a collection of experiences, memories, and emotional imprints. Some of them clear and understood, others buried beneath time, never fully processed. And it is often the unprocessed ones that speak the loudest, not through words, but through patterns. A person who constantly seeks reassurance may not simply be needy. There may have been a time when reassurance was absent, when emotional safety was uncertain, so the mind learned something important. If it is not asked for, it may not come, and that lesson does not disappear. It becomes a habit, a reflex, something that repeats itself even when the original situation is no longer present. In the same way, someone who criticizes others frequently may not be driven by judgment alone. There may be an internal voice that has been critical for years, a voice that was learned, adopted, and over time, what is internal often finds a way to become external, because emotions that are not understood do not simply stay contained. They move, they shift, they transfer, sometimes from one moment to another, sometimes from one person to another. This is how emotional weight is shared without being named, not through intention, but through repetition. There are fears that shape behavior in subtle ways. The fear of being ignored can create constant seeking. The fear of losing control can creates tension in every interaction. The fear of not being enough can turn conversations into quiet competitions for validation and recognition. These fears are rarely spoken directly. They do not introduce themselves. Instead, they appear as personality, as habits, as just the way someone is. And because they are familiar to the person carrying them, they often go unquestioned. But familiarity does not mean neutrality. What feels normal to one person can feel heavy to another. This is where misunderstanding begins. Because, on the surface, nothing seems extreme. There are no dramatic actions, no obvious harm, just small, repeated behaviors that slowly shape the emotional atmosphere. A conversation that always returns to one person's problems. A tone that carries quiet dissatisfaction. An interaction that leaves little room for others to exist fully. None of these moments feel significant on their own, but together they create a pattern, and patterns have weight. There is also something deeper at play. A need that has not been met does not disappear. It adapts. It finds indirect ways to be expressed, sometimes through attention-seeking, sometimes through control, sometimes through emotional dependence, and often the person is not fully aware of it, because awareness requires distance. And when something has been part of someone's identity for a long time, it no longer feels separate. It simply feels like truth, like reality. So the pattern continues, not as a conscious choice, but as a continuation of what has always been known. This is why labeling people too quickly can miss something important, because behind every draining behavior, there is usually a history, not an excuse, but a context, a deeper layer that explains why the pattern exists at all. And understanding this does not mean accepting the weight. It simply means seeing it more clearly, without reducing a person to a single trait, without ignoring the complexity of what shaped them. Because emotional patterns are rarely simple. They are built over time, through repetition, through experience, through moments that were never fully resolved. And once they are formed, they do not stay contained within one person. They become part of every interaction, every conversation, every silence, carried quietly from one space to another, until someone begins to notice, not to fix, not to confront, but simply to understand that what feels heavy in the present may not have started there. It may have begun long before, in places that are no longer visible, but still deeply influential. And this understanding changes something subtle. It softens judgment, not into acceptance, but into clarity. Because when something is seen in context, it becomes easier to recognize without confusion, easier to feel without absorbing it completely. And that is where awareness deepens, not just in what is experienced, but in where it comes from. There is a quiet exchange happening in every interaction, not just words, not just expressions, but something less visible, emotional energy. It moves between people constantly, without permission, without awareness, and most of the time, it goes unnoticed, because the mind is trained to focus on what is said, on logic, on meaning. But beneath that, the body is listening to something else: tone, pacing, micro-expression, signals that are too small to name, but too powerful to ignore. This is where emotional experience begins, not in thought, but in sensation. A slight tension, a shift in breathing, a subtle alertness that appears without reason, and before the mind can explain it, the body has already responded. This process is not random. It is deeply rooted in how the brain is designed to protect and connect. Humans are not isolated observers. They are emotional receivers, constantly interpreting the internal states of others, sometimes consciously, but more often unconsciously. There is a phenomenon often described as emotional contagion, not a dramatic transfer, not something that announces itself, but a quiet mirroring, where one person's emotional state begins to influence another's without either of them realizing it. A tense person can create tension in the room. An anxious presence can make others feel unsettled, even without a single word being spoken, because the brain is always asking a silent question: is this environment safe? And it does not wait for logical answers. It reads the room. It reads the people. It reads what cannot be easily explained. When someone carries unresolved stress, frustration, or emotional instability, those states are not contained within them. They leak through tone, through silence, through subtle inconsistencies between words and feeling. And the brain notices, not as a clear thought, but as a feeling. Something is off. And when that signal repeats, the body begins to prepare itself. Muscles tighten slightly. Attention becomes more focused. Energy is used just to maintain presence. This is where emotional exhaustion begins. Not through effort in action, but through effort in perception, because the mind is working quietly in the background, trying to interpret, trying to adjust, trying to maintain balance in an environment that does not feel entirely stable. This creates something known as cognitive load, a silent burden on attention, where the brain is processing more than it should need to. Not just the conversation, but the emotional subtext beneath it. And over time, this extra processing becomes tiring, even if nothing outwardly difficult has occurred. This is why some conversations feel heavier than others, not because of their length, not because of their complexity, but because of the emotional signals they carry. Clear interactions feel light. There is alignment between words and feeling, no hidden tension, no need to read between the lines. The mind can rest, but unclear interactions, ones filled with subtle contradiction, tension, or imbalance, require constant interpretation, and interpretation takes energy. There is another layer to this: boundaries, not physical ones, but emotional ones. The ability to experience another person's state without absorbing it completely, without losing the sense of where they end and where you begin. When boundaries are unclear, emotional experiences can blend. Another person's stress can start to feel personal. Their frustration can begin to influence internal calm, not because it belongs there, but because there is no clear separation. And this blending increases emotional fatigue, because the body is holding more than it should, not just personal emotions, but borrowed ones, ones that were never meant to stay. This is why awareness matters, not as a solution, not as a defense, but as a form of clarity, to recognize that not every feeling that appears originates from within. Some are responses, natural reactions to the emotional environment. And once this is understood, something begins to shift, not in the external interaction, but in the internal interpretation of it. The heaviness no longer feels confusing. It becomes understandable, not something random, but something with a pattern, a cause. And in that understanding, there is a quiet form of relief, because what is understood no longer feels as overwhelming. It becomes something that can be observed, felt, but not fully carried. And this is where emotional experience becomes clearer, not lighter yet, not resolved, but seen. And sometimes, seeing is the first step toward no longer absorbing everything that is felt. Not all emotional weight feels the same. It shifts, changes shape. Sometimes it is loud, sometimes it is almost invisible. But over time, certain patterns begin to repeat, not as fixed identities, but as familiar ways people move through connection. And when these patterns are observed closely, they begin to take form. The constant critic. There is always something missing, something not quite right. Even in moments that seem complete, their attention finds the flaw. It may sound like honesty, like high standards, but the feeling it leaves behind is different. A quiet sense of insufficiency. Conversations begin to feel like evaluations. Moments feel less like experiences and more like tests. And over time, being around them feels like slowly shrinking. Not because of what is said directly, but because of what is never fully accepted. The perpetual victim, their story rarely changes. The details shift, but the position remains the same. Something has always gone wrong. Someone has always treated them unfairly. And while empathy is natural, the pattern becomes heavier with repetition because there is no movement, no reflection, no sense of ownership, only a cycle that repeats itself with new faces and familiar endings. And slowly, the listener begins to feel responsible for a weight that never truly lifts. The emotional manipulator. Nothing is directly stated, but everything is implied. Guilt appears quietly. Expectations are unspoken, yet strongly felt. There is a subtle pressure to respond in certain ways, to act, to reassure, to give without being asked clearly. And when those expectations are not met, there is a shift, distance, coldness, or quiet disappointment, leaving behind confusion, not knowing what was required, but feeling as though something was failed. The endless complainer. There is always something wrong. The situation, the people, the timing, even neutral moments become filled with dissatisfaction. At first, it feels like venting, understandable, human, but over time, it becomes a constant atmosphere where nothing feels stable, nothing feels enough, and being present begins to feel like carrying a perspective that never settles. The attention seeker. Silence does not feel comfortable. There is a constant pull toward being seen, being heard. Conversations circle back to them. Moments shift toward their experience. Not always intentionally, but consistently and slowly. Space becomes limited. There is less room for others to exist fully, less room for shared presence, only a quiet imbalance that leaves others feeling unseen. The passive drainer. There is no obvious behavior, no clear negativity, and yet something feels heavy. Conversations lack depth. Energy feels low. There is little engagement, little emotional presence, and over time, the effort to maintain connection begins to feel one-sided, like giving attention into a space that does not return it. The overly dependent. They need closeness, constantly, reassurance, validation, presence. And while connection is natural, this need rarely feels satisfied because it does not come from the present moment. It comes from something deeper, something unresolved. So, no matter how much is given, it is never quite enough. And slowly, what begins as care turns into quiet exhaustion. None of these patterns are rare. They exist in different forms, in different people, sometimes clearly, sometimes subtly, and sometimes they overlap because human behavior is not fixed. It shifts, adapts, but what remains consistent is the feeling they leave behind. A gradual depletion, not immediate, not overwhelming at first, but steady, like something being taken in small amounts until it is finally noticed. And even then, it is not always easy to name because these patterns are not always harmful on the surface. They can exist within kindness, within familiarity, within relationships that otherwise feel meaningful, which makes the experience more complex because the mind does not want to reduce people to a single pattern, and it shouldn't. But awareness does not require reduction. It simply requires noticing that certain dynamics carry a cost, not because someone intends harm, but because something within them is still unresolved, still seeking, still repeating. And until that changes, the pattern continues, moving quietly from one interaction to another, leaving behind a feeling that is difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore once it is understood. Awareness changes something, but not everything, because even after something is seen clearly, it does not always become easy to step away from it. In fact, sometimes it becomes more difficult because now there is a conflict, not outside, but within, a quiet tension between what is felt and what feels right. You begin to notice the heaviness, the patterns, the repetition, the way certain interactions leave behind, a subtle exhaustion. And yet, the connection remains, the conversations continue, the presence is maintained, not because it feels good, but because something deeper is holding it in place. There is empathy, a natural ability to understand that the other person is not simply difficult, that there is a history behind the behavior, a reason it exists. And this understanding softens everything. It makes the weight easier to tolerate because it no longer feels random. It feels human. But empathy has a quiet complexity because while it allows understanding, it can also blur limits. The line between recognizing someone's pain and carrying it begins to fade, and without realizing it, empathy turns into responsibility, a feeling that staying is necessary, that leaving would mean abandoning, even when staying comes at a cost. There is also guilt, not loud, not obvious, but present, a quiet voice that asks, what if they need this? What if stepping back causes harm? And so, the discomfort is ignored again and again because the alternative feels heavier in a different way. There is the fear of conflict, of disrupting what already exists, because naming something changes it. It introduces tension, uncertainty, and sometimes loss. So silence feels safer, even if it comes with a cost, even if that cost is slow and cumulative. There is also something more subtle, the need for connection, a deeply human need to belong, to be seen, to remain connected to others, even imperfect ones. Because disconnection feels unnatural, it creates emptiness, and sometimes that emptiness feels heavier than the quiet drain of certain relationships. So the mind makes a quiet decision, not consciously, but through repetition. This is easier to keep than to lose. And so the pattern continues. Not because it is ideal, not because it is fully accepted, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity has a strange comfort, even when it is not entirely healthy. There is also the tendency to minimize, to compare. It's not that bad. Others have it worse. And through this comparison, the experience is reduced, smaller, easier to ignore. But the feeling does not reduce with it. It remains, quietly accumulating over time. This is the nature of inner conflict. Two truths existing at once: understanding and exhaustion, compassion and discomfort, connection and distance. And neither feels fully wrong, which is what makes it difficult to resolve, because there is no clear side to choose, no simple answer, just a quiet awareness that something feels off and a deeper pull to keep things as they are. And in this space, people often remain longer than they intend to, not because they are unaware, but because awareness alone does not dissolve attachment. It only illuminates it, shows it more clearly, makes the tension more visible. And sometimes that visibility is uncomfortable because it asks a silent question. What is being held onto and why? Not to judge, not to force change, but to understand the weight from both sides, the external pattern and the internal response to it. Because the experience of emotional drain is never created by one side alone. It exists in the space between behavior and response, between what is given and what is allowed to remain. And when this is seen, something shifts again, not in action, but in clarity. The situation is no longer just about them. It becomes something more complete, a reflection of both connection and self-awareness. And in that reflection, the experience begins to feel different, not resolved, but understood on a deeper level than before. Nothing changes suddenly. There is no sharp break, no clear moment where everything becomes different at once. Instead, something soft begins to move, a shift so quiet it can almost be missed. Awareness deepens, not as a thought, not as a decision, but as a way of seeing. The same interactions happen, the same people speak in the same ways, the same patterns continue, and yet they no longer feel exactly the same, because something inside has changed. There is now a small space between what is happening and how it is experienced. Before, everything felt immediate. A tone would be absorbed, a mood would be mirrored, a pattern would be felt as if it belonged within. But now there is a pause, not a forced one, a natural one, where the experience is noticed before it is fully taken in. And in that pause, something important happens. The feeling is still there, the heaviness, the subtle tension, but it is no longer as overwhelming because it is not fully identified with. It is seen as something present, but not entirely personal. This is where emotional distance begins. Not distance from people, but distance from automatic absorption. The ability to feel something without becoming it, to recognize a pattern without stepping into it completely. And this does not require effort. It happens quietly as a result of understanding, because once something is seen clearly, it loses part of its power to confuse. And confusion is what often creates intensity. When something is unclear, the mind tries to solve it, to interpret it, to respond to it, and this effort creates strain. But when the pattern is recognized, there is less to solve, less to interpret. The experience becomes simpler, not lighter yet, but clearer. And clarity has a calming effect, even when the situation itself has not changed. There is also a subtle release from responsibility, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet realization that not every emotion in the space needs to be carried, that another person's state can exist without becoming an internal burden. This does not remove empathy. It refines it, turns it into something more balanced, where understanding is present but not overwhelming, where connection exists but without quiet depletion. And this balance is not created through control. It emerges naturally when awareness becomes steady. There is less urgency to respond in certain ways, less pressure to fix, to soothe, to absorb, because the pattern is already understood. And understanding removes the need to react automatically. This changes the emotional rhythm of interactions. Conversations may become quieter, responses may become slower, not intentionally, but because there is no longer the same internal push to engage with every emotional signal. Some things are simply noticed and allowed to pass, like observing weather without trying to change it. And in this observation, there is a kind of calm, not complete peace, but a reduction in strain, because energy is no longer being used to process everything so deeply. There is also a growing sense of internal stability, a recognition that feelings can arise without defining the entire experience, that heaviness can be present without spreading fully inward. And this stability becomes a quiet anchor, something steady beneath changing interactions, something that does not depend on how others show up. And this is where the shift becomes meaningful, not because it changes others, but because it changes how their patterns are received. The same behaviors that once felt overwhelming now feel more contained, more external, still noticeable, but less consuming. And over time, this creates a different experience of connection, one that is less reactive, less draining, not because the environment has changed, but because perception has. And perception shapes experience in ways that are often underestimated. It determines what is absorbed and what is simply observed. And once this distinction becomes clear, something important is regained: energy, not through action, but through understanding, through no longer carrying what was never meant to be carried. And this is the quiet nature of change. It does not always appear as action. Sometimes it appears as awareness that becomes steady enough to reshape experience from within. The final chapter offers a calm and poetic reflection on emotional energy, human connection, and awareness. It does not resolve everything, but instead leaves the listener with a deeper sense of clarity, presence, and emotional understanding, a softer, more conscious way of existing with others. Not everything needs to be held. This realization does not arrive loudly. It does not demand attention. It settles quietly, like something that was always true, but only now feels visible. There will always be different kinds of people, different energies, different emotional patterns moving through the world. Some will feel light, effortless. Others will feel heavier, more complex. And this will not change completely because people carry what they carry, histories that are unseen, emotions that are still unfolding, patterns that continue until they are understood, and not all of them will be. But something else changes. The way these experiences are held, there is less urgency to explain everything, less need to fully understand every behavior, because not everything requires interpretation. Some things can simply be noticed and left where they are. This creates a softer way of existing, not detached, not indifferent, but less burdened, because the weight of constant emotional processing begins to fade. There is no longer the same need to carry every tone, every shift, every subtle signal that appears in others. Some things are allowed to pass through without being kept, and this changes the internal landscape. It becomes quieter, more spacious, not empty, but open, where feelings can arise without filling the entire space, where interactions can happen without defining the whole experience. There is also a different kind of clarity now, a quiet recognition that connection does not have to mean absorption, that being present with someone does not require becoming what they feel. And this distinction is gentle but powerful because it allows closeness without depletion, understanding without exhaustion. It also changes how people are seen, not as sources of weight, but as individuals moving through their own internal worlds, some aligned, some still in conflict. And this perspective softens judgment without removing awareness, because it is possible to see clearly without needing to label harshly, to recognize patterns without reducing a person to them. And this balance creates a different kind of peace, not the absence of difficult interactions, but the absence of being overwhelmed by them. There is also a quiet acceptance that not every connection will feel easy, and that this is part of being human. But ease is no longer the only measure. Clarity becomes just as important. The ability to sense what is happening without becoming lost in it. And over time, this clarity shapes experience in subtle ways. Conversations feel different. Presence feels different, not because others have changed, but because something within is no longer reacting in the same way. And this is where energy begins to return, not through effort, but through release, through no longer holding what was never yours to carry. There is a calm in this, a quiet steadiness that does not depend on external harmony, because it exists within perception itself. And once this steadiness is felt, even briefly, it becomes something that can be returned to, not perfectly, not constantly, but gradually, again and again, until it becomes familiar, a softer baseline for how life is experienced. And in that softness, there is space, space for connection, space for difference, space for emotion without overwhelm. Not everything will feel light, but not everything will feel heavy either, because what is carried is now chosen more carefully, not through force, but through awareness that has become steady enough to guide experience quietly. And in the end, nothing dramatic has changed. The world remains the same. People remain complex, but the way it all feels becomes gentler, more breathable, as if something invisible has been set down at last.